Good morning, everyone. It's the first event for the City of Literature, first event on Saturday for the City of Literature, and I'm happy to welcome you. My name is Maeve Clark. I used to work here. Now I just oversleep, but I'm calm now, so we can get started. Welcome to the 2023 Iowa City Book Festival, presented by the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature. We would like to thank the sponsors and partners that made this event possible: the Iowa City Public Library, the University of Iowa, the City of Iowa City, Prairie Lights, Iowa City Public Library, the Graduate Hotel, and Think Iowa City. Support has also been provided by the Iowa Humanities Council and the National Endowment of the Humanities. Between events, be sure to visit the book fair at Merge, right next door to the Public Library on the Ped Mall. The vast majority of book festivals events are offered without charge, but they're not free. Please consider donating to the City of Literature by visiting iowicitybookfestival.org and clicking on Support. Today we will hear from author Josh Larsen. Josh Larsen is the co-host of the radio show and podcast Filmspotting, author of Movies Are Prayers and the new Fear Not, A Christian Appreciation of Horror. He also serves as editor-producer of Think Christian, a website and podcast exploring faith and pop culture. He has been writing and speaking about the movies professionally since 1984. While in Iowa City, Josh will be part of a live recording of Filmspotting podcast as part of the ReFocus Film Festival at Film Scene. This will be at 1:30 at the Chauncey. Now, please help me welcome Josh.
Good morning, hearty souls. Can you guys hear me all right if I stand here with the mic? Who scheduled a talk on horror at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning? The answer is I did. I did select this slot. It worked out the best, so it's my fault, but I'm glad that you're here and interested enough in this topic to come out on a somewhat dreary Saturday morning. Because we're a smaller group, we'll try to make this, I do have a presentation, as you can see. We are live streaming as well, so that's why I have to stay at the podium. But we'll try to maybe make this a little more conversational, if that's okay with you. If not, you don't have to jump in, but maybe that'll work a little bit better with a smaller group. But I do want to start with this presentation, and actually, if you don't mind, again, maybe a little strange at this time of day, but let's start with something a little scary.
Mrs. Bates.
So, why would you want to watch that? That's 1960s Psycho, of course, the Alfred Hitchcock classic film, notorious horror movie, has an even scarier, much scarier scene, as you all probably know, in a hotel shower. But it is a question I get a lot. Maybe some of you two get that as well. If you watch a lot of horror films from family members, friends, maybe you're here asking that question and you're curious, what is it about horror that attracts people? Why is it such a huge and successful genre? And, I understand the question because horror is always anxiety-inducing, something we get enough in our regular lives, right? Often very grisly. Among movie genres, it can be among the most exploitative, definitely. So these are all reasons for caution that I get. I also get this question a lot because as a Christian film critic, some people assume, well, that's the genre you don't touch, right? That's the one you stay away from. And I got the question enough that I figured it'd be worth really trying to dig into and answer for myself. Try to get down on paper, what is it about this genre that does attract me, and particularly, what might it look like through a theological lens? And the folks at Fuller Theological Seminary noticed just the increasing interest in horror in recent years, and they have a monograph series of books about theology in film, and they thought, well, we need a book on horror as well. And they knew that I loved horror and asked me to contribute to that series. So that's how I got around to do Fear Not, a Christian appreciation of horror movies. A really exciting project. It did start as just a blog post I wrote maybe in 2015 or so at Think Christian, offering a very beginning defense of horror for Christians. Explored a few basic ideas, but again, it was a blog post, and this was a chance to strengthen that argument and then put it to the test in book form. Now, I should back up and note a little bit where my love for horror began. Why is this something that I even had an interest in at the beginning? And the truth is, before I was drawn to horror, I was deeply, deeply disturbed by horror, and that's probably because, and I've found in doing talks, this is a common thing, I was exposed to it way too young. And this wasn't because my parents didn't do a good job. They loved movies, and we saw movies all the time, but they were also discerning. I had my limits, I had my rules. But there are always neighbors' houses. There are always, in my case, the cousin's house on a Sunday night. We had a family tradition of every Sunday night going for Sunday night coffee, it was called. This was a multi-generational, 10 kids would be there, second cousins, third cousins, my grandma's sisters' houses where it would often be. And the adults would be up there, upstairs, talking, ignoring the kids. This was, late 70s, early 80s, different style of parenting then. And we were free to just run and do what we want. And so that often meant we'd end up in the basement watching TV. And yeah, if a horror movie was on TV, that's what we were going to watch. Too bad for the little kids, right? Or they would eventually fall asleep. So I saw something like Psycho, I don't know the age, probably 10, something like that, on TV with a group of older cousins. It was edited, of course, so it wasn't the full Psycho. I also saw The Shining this way for the first time. And let me tell you, it's still going to mess you up as a kid, even if it's edited. So I had this fear fascination with the genre from a very young age. And then if you jump ahead 5 years or so, so maybe I'm a teenager at this point, really starting to get into movies, like getting obsessed with movies and trying to figure out why do they affect me so? What is it about them that makes them work? And so I'm asking questions about the filmmaking, creative decisions that are made, the techniques that are employed, the filmmakers who are regarded as great, and checking out the movies they made. And what I realized is, a lot of this really interesting stuff is being done in the horror genre. Take The Shining, for instance, okay? This is Stanley Kubrick here, film master working in the horror genre. And I'm sure most of you know, but it's based on the Stephen King novel about a 5-year-old boy who's stuck in this deserted mountain hotel for the winter with just his parents. His father's the caretaker. It's just the three of them. Jack Nicholson plays the father in the movie version. And as you know, things don't go well, most of you know. But I do want to look at The Shining together a little bit here. And it'll give us a chance to talk a little bit about that technique that did move me to this appreciation of horror, even though I was kind of scarred by it at a younger age. Teenage years, again, I started really appreciating what filmmakers were doing with the genre. So let's watch, don't worry, this is pretty tame, but a little bit from The Shining. So if you have seen The Shining, you know we don't want to see what's in that room. We won't watch any further. If you want to see what's in that room, we are going to be showing it tonight at 10 p.m. as part of ReFocus Film Fest. So I'm going to be introducing that, talking about The Shining in a little more detail in relation to the book, and then, yeah, we'll subject ourselves to the whole thing. So maybe make that part of your plans for the weekend. But let's talk about some of the filmmaking here, some of the craft. These sequences, and I think there's at least 2 sections like this of young Danny, the boy, played by Danny Lloyd, pedaling his big wheel through these empty halls of the hotel. They are captured via the brilliant use of the Steadicam. So this is this stabilizing apparatus for a movie camera that allows you to basically have these smooth, unbroken shots that move through a scene, okay? And here, the Steadicam inventor, actually, Garrett Brown, is operating the camera in these scenes. He would sit in a wheelchair to get that effect. And the effect is what is so entrancing to me. It's incredibly eerie, I find, especially in the way it increases the anxiousness and apprehension of these moments by emphasizing the emptiness of the space that is around Danny. And then once we have a sense of that, it's all about how are we moving through it? Or, this is how I experience it, how are we being moved through it? You know, this is a story of, one way to look at it, of a haunted hotel. There are definitely these metaphysical forces at play in this movie. And so it's that movement that is so key for me. I mean, we do have the music, very effective. We do have the lighting, those stark hotel lights, I think add to the mood. But for me, it's that movement. It's almost as if, you know, Danny is not propelling himself. It's kind of like he's being pulled forward through those hallways. And then because of the Steadicam use, we're being pulled along with him. And there's this fascinating helplessness that comes with that, I feel like. So, jumping back to when I was younger, I should just note too, though, that personally, one reason this is such a terrifying movie for me is that when I was about 5, I think, I looked just like Danny Lloyd as a kid. Here, I got some evidence of this here. So that's me on the left. Now, when I saw The Shining, I wasn't this young, but I knew I looked like this. So seeing that poor little kid felt a little bit like looking at myself in a horror show mirror. I got over that, and I did come to appreciate horror, as I said, as a film critic because of the craft. Go back to Psycho, think about that shower scene, the use of editing, the technique that's so crucial there. All those edits, it makes us feel like we're watching this stabbing, but we really never see the slicing of skin at all. Yet it's regarded as one of the most terrifying horror scenes in memory. So things like that just began to fascinate me. But now let's go to that second question. Okay, that makes sense as a film critic, but what about as a Christian film critic? If you're going to look at this beyond questions of aesthetics or technique or craft, I think those should all be considered as a Christian film critic as well. But what about some of these other objections that someone might bring to the genre? And so I did, through the book, through Fear Not, want to apply this theological lens to it. And my starting point, as the title does imply, is to think about the idea of fear first, right? What is fear from a Christian perspective? And that title, Fear Not, appears. It's one of the most frequently offered encouragements in the Bible. Some translations, it's do not be afraid, or a variation like that. But we see it so often. If you think about the Old Testament, we see it in the mouths of prophets. They often will speak this to the nation of Israel when Israel is facing an enormous threat. Angels will say, fear not, do not be afraid. At Christ's birth, to the shepherds who are quaking with fear, they're told to fear not. Christ's resurrection, the bewildered disciples who do not know what's going on. Their whole world has been rocked. The angels tell them, fear not. And there are instances of Jesus himself saying a variation on this phrase. I think of the one story where he says this to a father whose daughter is on death's door. So we hear this a lot in Scripture, and the reason is because the Bible has a lot of stuff we should be afraid of. There is so much horror in the Bible. If you're a churchgoer, these aren't always the stories that are preached on very frequently, but if you read the text, it's there, right? Look at how soon murder slashes into the biblical story. It's in the 4th chapter of Genesis. This is when Cain tricks his brother Abel and then murders him. And it's interesting how Abel almost becomes this ghost who haunts Scripture. If you look at Genesis 4:10, there's the phrase about how his blood cries out. And then you also have eulogies for Abel all the way in Matthew 23, and then also Hebrews 11, verse 4. And so if we think of this in movie terms, you know, we're thinking about characters like the murdered little girl in The Sixth Sense. Both she and Abel, they exist as these indictments on the living, implicating some sort of guilt, right? Also in Scripture, frequently there are mention of demons. And maybe the most terrifying instance of this is Jesus' encounter with a man possessed by Legion. That is the name because in Mark 5 it said, "We are many." This is some very creepy stuff, and one of the most acclaimed, beloved horror movies is The Exorcist, where little Regan McNeil, her tiny body becomes kind of this sadistic tool in the claws of this demonic possessor in ways that resonate with that biblical story involving Legion. Regan McNeil is also tormented. If you look further in Mark 5, there's this description: night and day, among the tombs and in the hills, this man would cry out and cut himself with stones. Here I almost wonder, think of a character like the Wolfman, a perennial movie horror character. Is there something of the Wolfman's tormented howling? This is the 1941 version here in that story. So as you can see, for many horror films, you can find an equivalent somewhere in the Bible that lines up with that. And this is what I started to try to pair up when I looked at the book. I also wanted to ask another question, though. What are we to do with the fears that are expressed, both on the screen and in Scripture? Okay, and look at some of the fears we've touched on in some of these stories and some of these movies. There's fear of vengeance, fear of violence, fear of our faulty minds, our minds starting to go. How about fear of a spiritual realm that we cannot fully comprehend? Okay, this is another shared fear. If you look at the Bible itself, what does the Bible do with these fears? Why are they in there? Okay, well, I think it's very reflective that Scripture names them, puts them out there right in front of our face, not sweeping them under the rug. And I really believe one of the reasons the Bible remains this vital document, you know, thousands of years on, is because it does speak to the entirety of the human experience. Our ghastly experiences, our beautiful ones, it speaks to all of those. But if we're talking about horror, we're thinking about these ghastly ones, right? That come from our brokenness, that come from creation's brokenness. Theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he recognized this and in fact preached a sermon about it in 1933 titled "Overcoming Fear." And in this sermon, Bonhoeffer is reflecting on another scary story from Scripture, a little different than demons or murder, but the furious storm of Matthew 8. This is the tempest that threatens to drown the disciples until Jesus calms the storm. And here is what Bonhoeffer wrote about that. Fear is, somehow or other, the arch-enemy itself. It crouches in people's hearts. It hollows out their insides until their resistance and strength are spent, and they suddenly break down. Fear secretly gnaws and eats away at all the ties that bind a person to God and to others. And when in a time of need that person reaches for those ties and clings to them, they break, and the individual sinks back into himself or herself, helpless and despairing, while hell rejoices. So this is pretty grim, pretty visceral stuff, but it's also true. Some of this might sound and feel familiar to you at some points in your life. And it's worth pointing out that these are, you know, honest, vulnerable observations that come from a man who faced historical, world-shaking fears. Some of you likely know this, but Bonhoeffer was a German Lutheran pastor who opposed the Nazi regime and was executed in a concentration camp. So these sorts of immense fears and terrors were something that Bonhoeffer experienced. Yet if you look at this sermon, again, well before that in 33, it also speaks to more timeless, universal fears, fears of illness. He touches on illness elsewhere in the sermon, but also primal fears, you know, fears of violent storms, fears even of the dark, those ones that are just so buried deep within us, right from birth, it feels like. So like the Bible, Bonhoeffer doesn't deny these fears. He doesn't tell us, well, you know, just look the other way. Don't worry about it. He acknowledges them, just as Matthew 8 acknowledges that storm. And to me, this suggests that the expression of fear is a more Christian response than the repression of it. This is a recurring thing I saw as I was looking at some of these stories in the Bible. Horror in the Bible acknowledges the deep-seated terror that we do experience in this broken world, and to sweep that away will just run against the grain of Scripture. So let's bring this back to horror movies, and fear not, and begin to think about the different fears that movies now explore. Okay, we've seen some of the fears that the Bible explores, but let's look at movies now. And it did occur to me, one thing I love about horror is it is such a rich variety of subgenres. You can break them down into all different types of horror, right? Some of you might hate one type of horror, love another type of horror. That's very common. And looking at these subgenres, it struck me that not always, but in general, you could say that each subgenre, slashers, zombie movies, ghost stories, creature features, each of these tends to explore their own particular fear. Some of them hit on a number of them, but in general, you could find a handful that do tend to be exploring a particular fear. So a slasher like Psycho explores one fear, psychological horror like The Shining explores another, ghost story like The Sixth Sense we saw one, and then The Wolfman, a monster movie, I would say, explores another. So that's how I organized the book, Fear Not. I basically devoted each chapter to a different horror subgenre, and then I connected that subgenre to a commonly shared fear, went back into the Bible, see where the Bible acknowledges and speaks to that fear, then went back to the horror films where we see the fear being explored, sometimes even answered, in a way that does echo Scripture. So it was kind of, if there were 2 points, I was looking to get to the middle, while being true to what I found in Scripture and honoring what the movie was offering on the screen, the aesthetics and the techniques there too. As I said, that sometimes gets lost when it comes to Christian film criticism. People can be more interested in message, but I would argue that aesthetics and technique are just as important. So take that in one hand, take this in the other, and find a place where the two might meet. That's why the book isn't comprehensive, nor am I claiming this is the only way to think theologically about horror films. This is just one way of doing it. And when I found a film that met in the middle there with Scripture, I did include it in the book. So to help me break that down in detail, this is where we'll have a little more fun, gets to be interactive for those of you who want to be. I know it's early, but I think some of you can probably do it. And if you don't mind grabbing the mic, that'll help for us in the room, but also the live stream. What I want to do is talk about some of these subgenres and talk about some of the horror movies you've seen. Okay, let's start with a very easy question. Can be simple. You could just name the title and leave it at that. Or you can name a title and share a little bit about your memory of seeing it. But what is the scariest movie you've ever seen?
Legends of Sleepy Hollow with the scene where they dig up all the heads in the ground. That's like that they're like, and there's blood coming out of all of them. They're like bleeding.
I think that's probably the Tim Burton version with Johnny Depp.
Yeah,
does that sound right?
It's the live action, non-animated.
Yeah. Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah,
anyone else?
And it's of course it's rated R.
Okay, probably. Yeah, generally horror tends to be. Anyone else want to share scariest movie they've ever seen?
Hang on.
Mulholland Drive.
Oh, okay. Mulholland Drive. David Lynch. I don't write about that in the book, but I do write about Lynch with the Eraserhead. Yeah. Yep, in the front here.
It. I can't look at balloons anymore.
It has ruined balloons for you. Is that the TV version, the TV miniseries, or the more recent? The more recent. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
This is pretty standard, but I'd say The Exorcist marred me from when I was young.
Yeah, when you were young. Were you too young?
I was, and I snuck into my grandmother's living room to try to watch it on TV.
So was she watching it, or did you just put it on?
No, the parents were in the kitchen, and I was trying to turn the volume down so they wouldn't catch me as I was watching it.
Sounds like a similar story. Okay. Yes. All right. Thank you. Well, good. Yeah,
The
go ahead.
Haunting
Ray.
of Hill House?
Oh, now there's been two or three
first.
versions. The
Very
very
first
first.
one.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, it still haunts me.
Some incredible imagery in that one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a film called Funny Games.
Ooh.
Are you familiar with that?
Yeah,
And the reason
Michael
it's
Haneke.
so terrifying to me is because it's such a deconstruction of genre. It's so realistic, and there's even, as it goes on, it really is like, this is not a film. Like, there's no long monologue for them to have time to get out. It's literally like supposed to be as close to real life. And that's what's so scary about it for me.
Yeah. Funny Games. Home Invasion probably is the subgenre there, which is a terrifying one. Actually, I don't write about home invasion in the book. It wasn't really a specific choice. I'd be curious if I also had a limited word count, I should say. So, but I'd be curious to do this exercise with home invasion. But you're right, there's something about the reality-based nature of that subgenre that does make it disturbing. Maybe more than anything else, it's one of those where you're like, oh, this could happen. Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else? Otherwise, let's jump and talk a little bit about religious horror, because I think The Exorcist falls into that category. And this will give me a chance to just show you kind of what I did once I kind of arranged things how I thought they would go. You can see some of the subgenres here that I do cover. I do more than these, but slashers, I read about Halloween and some others. Found footage, one of my favorite horror subgenres, The Blair Witch Project, one of my favorite horror movies. I talked about The Shining, which I mentioned as psychological horror. And then, yeah, The Exorcist here as religious horror. If you don't mind me putting you on the spot, just your idea, what do you think the fear that The Exorcist, but religious horror in general, might be exploring? So I'm thinking about any movie where religion is a primary element. A lot of times it is an exorcism movie, possession movies, but can be different sorts of films. But when you think about those sorts of films, does a particular fear they might be exploring come to mind for you?
Yeah, it's hard for me to say. I would say it's hard for me to separate the aesthetic from the theological. Of course, when I saw it, I didn't really have any theological formation. I was pretty young at the time. But looking back on it now, I would say the fear is the fear of something that is so foreign to nature, completely supernatural. And of course, combining that with Reagan and such a young innocent is just, it's horrifying. There's the only word I
Yeah.
the idea, hopefully I'm not spoiling this for when you see the words on your stomach that says "help me," I mean, that's indelible. I'll never forget that. And again, so foreign to nature. You mentioned the scripture verse with Legion, and that's exactly what I think of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I kind of ended up in the same place when I thought about this genre, religious horror, and the way I termed it in the book is fear of a spiritual realm, because that can be fearful for you whether you're a person of faith, because it kind of means like, when the Apostle Paul talks about the powers of this dark world, we can kind of breeze past that maybe. Again, maybe not one of those passages we tend to get a lot of sermons on, but it's there. And when you watch a religious horror movie, you're kind of like, oh yeah, that is in the Bible, isn't it? That can be unsettling. If you're not a person of faith, you watch one of these movies and you might have to consider that, ooh, what if there is something beyond the veil? And so I think this is a destabilizing genre for all audiences, honestly. And The Exorcist, cited as one of, it's weird, it's like one of the most beloved, if I can use that word, by a lot of Christians who do like horror. And I have a complicated relationship with The Exorcist in that I tend to sense a gap between the genuine interest in that crisis of faith, the tension between faith and science. One of the main characters is a priest who's struggling with his faith and tends to trust more in science at this point in his life. And I think that's all fascinating. And to me, sometimes I feel, and I've watched this movie so many times, have come around to mostly appreciate it, but a tension there with, that gets lost in the more the ante gets upped in the crazed possession scenes and stuff, some of the film's interest in those ideas tends to get lost. But that's just me. I'm on the outside on that one. Most people really do love The Exorcist wholeheartedly. I think of a movie in the in this subgenre too. This goes to your point about saying something that is wholly unfamiliar, I think you said. So religious horror doesn't tend to scare me that much because it's not wholly unfamiliar, having been raised in the church. Not Catholic. Religious horror films tend to be Catholic in nature, I think, mostly, but familiar enough with those traditions and the iconography and the language and the scripture verses that that's not unfamiliar to me when I go see a religious horror film. So I don't feel unsettled in that way. Whereas it might be for someone who never grew up with any of this and they're walking like, what are all these weird phrases? What are the, it's just, I can see that would be unsettling. So it was very revealing to me, a film I write about in this chapter as religious horror, Ganja and Hess, from the 70s, the blaxploitation era. The writer-director is Bill Gunn, and it mixes, it's sort of a vampire movie, but not really, sort of a zombie movie, but not really. It's about an anthropologist who is stabbed by a dagger that is from, it comes from Africa, and this was made up for the movie, but basically an occult African religion. And that dagger, after being stabbed by it, makes him thirsty for blood. At the same time, this man's limo driver on the side is a pastor at an American church, Christian, perhaps Baptist church. I don't think they identify it. And so the movie brings together these two spiritual experiences and intermingles them. There are hymns being sung that are familiar to me, and then there are these more chanting songs of African origin that are unfamiliar to me. And both are held in the movie as being true representatives of the spiritual realm. That movie messed me up precisely because what you're talking about, it had these unfamiliar elements that were suggesting this spiritual realm that I was unfamiliar with. And so that worked on me, I imagine maybe in a way that a more traditional Catholic-based religious horror film might work on someone who's unfamiliar with those practices and rites. Other religious horror films that work in this way. The Conjuring, has anyone seen The Conjuring, a more recent one? What I like about that, there's a prop that's so effective in that movie, this music box that opens up, creepy clown pops up, of course, but what's really unsettling about it is the mirror in the back of the lid. If you hold the mirror up and look into it, you'll see something behind you that if you turn around is not there. Okay, and for me, I kind of anchored the chapter around that image because it speaks to this fear of this spiritual realm that the family in The Conjuring, they have no faith. So for them, this is when their house begins to be haunted or weird things are happening, they don't go to this answer that might be based in any sort of spirituality. Yet, what is that in the mirror? That can't be explained by science. And so that's just a great effect in that film. The Witch, the Robert Eggers film, I would also classify as religious horror. The Exorcism of Emily Rose, another exorcism movie that I write about in the book as well. So that's just one example of some of the, see if I can give you some other subgenres I do cover. I mentioned zombies, slashers. I do a whole,
I think something's happening to this room. It might be,
is that in here?
no. It was a little bit of horror for you.
I did not arrange that. I don't know if there's a library invasion subgenre. Let's hope not. Probably that. Sex and Death is another chapter because, yes, it's kind of, so many of these are in the slasher subgenre, but horror is so, this is where a lot of the exploitation goes in. Horror is so afraid of sexuality, right? I posit in the book that the Bible is actually more sex positive than the horror subgenre. When you think about how many of these movies are about the naughty teenagers who must be killed because they've been having sex. And the moralism there is just so oppressive. So that was fascinating to explore. Body horror, a subgenre I am actually kind of drawn to, but I know most people, like, that's where they draw the line. I write about that as being an exploration of, fear of mortality, basically. Fear that we are in bodies that decay, and there's nothing we can do about that. This is another fear that the Bible not only chronicles, but speaks to with great hope as well. Don't always get that hope in the horror, in the body horror genre. One more I'll mention, prophetic horror. And this we've seen a lot more of in recent years. I would describe, it's been around forever. I go back to, from the 40s, I Walked with a Zombie, I think is prophetic horror about the slave trade from an earlier era. But even, as recently, I think this was kicked off with fresh vigor with Jordan Peele's Get Out in 2017, I think. And since we've had a new wave of prophetic horror that, like the Old Testament prophets, exposes the idols we worship now and how those lead to societal evil in particular. So Get Out, the idolatry of white supremacy is what's being exposed there. Jordan Peele's Us, which I happen to like even better, I feel like exposes the idol of consumerism and the costs we're willing to overlook, the human costs to have the items and live the lifestyle that we want. That is also a very contemporary societal evil that Us is exploring. So I have a whole chapter on movies that do that as well. All right, we'll leave a little time here, maybe for discussion. Let's do that. If you want, here's what I'm going to do. Let me get a sense, since we're a small group. How many of you would say, quick poll, mostly avoid horror, haven't really seen many films? Okay. Interesting. Okay. Open to horror, like it, we'll see it. Okay. Any like my favorite genre? Horror. Okay.
I'm mixed.
Mixed. Okay, that's fair.
Well, I think I'm mixed too because there's some I'm going to avoid. I mean,
And that's common, sure. That's where the subgenres can come in, right?
and like slasher stuff is just it's stupid. I mean, for me. So I'm sorry if you're a slasher fan, but that's one of the things I won't watch most
Yeah,
times.
that's fair. Totally fair. And that's a common experience, I think. Well, let me do this before we open up to Q&A then. I'm going to give you some recommendations since we do have a nice mix, which I love. That's kind of cool. Thank you to those of you who are tentative about horror for coming. I appreciate that. This might be helpful. So I lead for Think Christian, a movie club. We gather quarterly online, and next Monday we're doing it actually. If you want to join us, you can. We're going to talk more about horror. thinkchristian.net/movie club is where you can sign up, and we'll send you the Zoom link. But yeah, we are going to do horror for this session. And one of the movie club members, we haven't really done something like this before. We did do Jordan Peele, but we've done like Wes Anderson, we've done the Oscars, we've done all sorts of stuff. So one of the movie club members emailed me and was like, I'm not so sure about horror. Can you, in preparation for this meeting, give us like some options, like a couple of titles, and say, well, here's a mild one, here's a medium one, and here's a spicy one, depending on where we're at. I thought that is a great idea, so thank you for doing that, and I stole it for this. So if you're just thinking about horror, I would suggest The Wolfman from 1941. Tell yourself right away, it's from 1941, okay? And you could laugh your way all through this thing, and that's fine. Even if you come to love it, you'll probably chuckle a few moments, maybe some of the makeup, but it is so theologically interesting about this main character who, again, the Apostle Paul's words, why do I do what I do not want to do? What I want to do, I cannot do. There was a very paraphrase there. That's the central tension of The Wolfman, right? And these universal horror pictures from this era are gorgeous in terms of their set design, production design, cinematography, the black and white. It's just beautiful stuff. So if nothing else, you can immerse yourself in that. Very easy to get into horror starting there. Probably this is a medium suggestion most people have seen. People don't think about The Sixth Sense as a horror movie. It is absolutely a horror movie. To your point, I think it might be rated PG-13, but it has some very scary moments. ghosts all over the place. And I do think, however, it's an easier move into the genre, okay? It's a mystery as well. And the characters here are so rich. Toni Collette's mother, one of my favorite horror performances ever, but you also have Haley Joel Osment as this boy, this tormented boy, and Bruce Willis giving one of his best performances as a child psychologist. So I think that makes it, you connect with these characters so much. I think even if you're not that open to horror, you'll allow them to take you along in the story. So that's a medium suggestion. You want to get spicy, go to the Blair Witch Project. Again, this is one you could scoff your way through. If you go in and say, this movie is not going to scare me. And this is what happened to it in 1999 because it was such a sensation. It broke out at the Sundance Film Festival, partly because they very smartly marketed it as being real, okay? The conceit here, it's found footage horror movie, so is that three filmmakers went out in the Maryland woods to make a documentary about a local legend about a witch. They disappeared. This is the footage that was found. And it was just edited together, and can you believe this? That's what people at Sundance were told this actually was. And, I think it was fairly clear that it wasn't, but this was, again, 99, social media wasn't around. I mean, word didn't spread as fast as it does. It kind of lingered. And so by the time, huge hit because of that. But by the time it got to mainstream theaters in the summer, people went into it like this. Like, this is the scariest movie of all time? Let me see it. No horror movie is going to work like that. Okay, so if you're up for the Blair Witch Project, which I do think is one of the scariest movies of all time, watch it with the lights out at night, maybe a couple of other people, but not too many. And this is one that still works on your laptop because it is found footage. It kind of makes sense to be in that sort of presentation. And it'll mess you up. So that's the spicy suggestion. I'm sure probably those of you who are into horror have already seen it. If it's been a while, revisit it because it's not a one-trick pony. It's not now I know how it works, so it's going to be boring to watch again. No, the second time you'll see how much, and these were first-time filmmakers, how much craft and technique, to kind of go back to where we started, is employed here. The editing choices, the use of off-screen space, what you don't see but you hear. When to let the screen go black and just let the sound do the work. There's two cameras being used. I better stop. I could keep going on about the Blair Witch Project. But there's a video camera that's color footage with audio that we hear. There's also, I think it's like a 16 millimeter black and white camera they had that doesn't have audio with it. And their choice of when to let us see the black and white, but hear the video audio. I mean, this is such a sophisticated movie. That looks like it was found under a pile of leaves in the woods. It's brilliant. I think we're almost out of time. So give each of these a chance to scare you if you're up for it and maybe even speak to you, on this deeper spiritual level. Thank you for your attention and your participation. I appreciate that. We do have a couple of minutes if there are any other questions. We'd be happy to answer them.
So you talked about how obviously in the Bible there's so much expression of horror and that we should take that seriously and that is almost intrinsically part of Christianity. There are certain movies that get critically panned as being sort of trash or why does this exist in the world?
Yeah.
From a Christian perspective, do you have examples or is it even possible for a movie to cross a line into something that just should not be made, or is the expression of horror just intrinsically worthwhile to the Christian experience?
It's a great question. And you're kind of touching on the issue of discernment there, I feel like. That's how, it will be talked about in a faith circle. How do we discern what we should or should not be watching? I do feel like discernment is personal. So it's very hard. This makes it more difficult, right? It'd be a lot easier. I know this isn't really what you're asking for, but it'd be a lot easier to say, here's the okay list, here's the not okay list, right? And I don't think it works that way because what is, what's problematic for me in my faith walk, and this might be because of issues of addiction, it might be for issues of temptation, it might be for issues of past trauma, who knows? if it's not helpful for me, if it doesn't bear good fruit for me, then I have every right to say, out with slashers, out with this particular title. I think we get into trouble when we try to put it on that list for everyone. So I do personally have those films for various reasons that and because I'm a film critic, I usually, unfortunately, have to make that distinction after seeing them. It's like, oh, yeah. And sometimes I'll hold that against the film. I think that's fair. We all bring our personal lenses to movies, right? But again, I don't think it's helpful to make this list, this like no-go list. That I just don't know if that's a way to engage with art. Let me put it this way: if not a huge, and I have not seen all of them, not a huge fan of the Saw franchise, right? From what I have seen, for reasons I won't get into, I would find them, you know, the ones I've seen, kind of deeply at odds with a Christian understanding of the body, if we're talking about body horror. But if someone wants to present to me a theological defense of the Saw franchise, I will be the first one to read it. You know, I would like to understand what another person sees there from that particular perspective. And if they make a good argument, you know, that's completely valid. So I'm not saying, you know, why are you even watching those? Does that kind of help? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think there was another one in front here.
I was just wondering, a lot of horror traffics in what I would call very simplistic portrayals of religion or Christianity. And some of these movies can be very good in their own right. Despite that, I was wondering what you make of a movie. I would suggest Carrie as maybe one of those movies.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like religion can be as familiar of a trope in horror as a jump scare. So I think I've seen it so much, I regard it the same way. Like, you know, jump scares can be cliches, exploitative elements, and if they are, then it's like, well, that wasn't very creative. But they can also be extremely effective. On Filmspotting, we just did a top 5 jump scares list. And we spent, pardon me? Oh my gosh, no, I can never name my top 5s after I've done them. Afterwards, I'll look it up and tell you. But there was one from Get Out. I remember that one. Yeah, early on, hitting the deer. Yeah, so I would consider what you're talking about in the same category to be, the religious element in horror movies comes with the territory, and it's how the filmmaker is going to use it. I think this gets back to The Exorcist for me. I feel like there are parts of that film where it's just a trope. It's just a way to get to what, you know, the stuff that the movie's most excited about. And then there are other elements in the movie where that's supremely what The Exorcist is interested in exploring. So I find a disconnect there, kind of exactly what you're talking about.
Isn't the title religious horror film a little problematic? Because it seems to me movies of the 40s and 50s, maybe even some in the 60s, like The Robe with Richard Burton and Gene Simmons, the Song of Bernadette with Jennifer Jones, Ben-Hur, those are with Charlton Heston. Those movies, it seems to me, inspire faith in people who are already faithful. But something like The Exorcist and the other one I'm thinking of, the Omen series. It seems to me religion is a kind of metaphysic, even in the Dracula movies, you know, Dr. Van Helsing. The cross in front, the vampires run scurrying. But it seems religion is magic. It's not something that inspires people. So it's there to scare you, but it's not there to inspire you.
Yeah, this is somewhat related to what, you know, we were just talking about. I think you're right. The crucifix is another very handy symbol that horror films pull out because, we know what that means and what it will do. So again, it comes back to me to trying to get a sense of what the motivation on the part of the filmmakers is, or even beyond that, take away the filmmaker's motivation, because a movie, I always feel, becomes its own living, breathing thing once it's on the screen. When is the movie most invested in what it's showing you? When can you feel its blood pumping, and when can you feel that it's just up there on the screen? And if its blood is pumping when it's using those religious elements exploitatively, okay, that's not doing much for me. You bring to mind something about The Exorcist. So there's a new sequel to The Exorcist, The Exorcist Believer. I've not seen it yet, just opened last week. But for Think Christian, I'm in the process of editing a post on someone who did see it and had reservations about it, precisely along the lines you're talking about. Apparently the plot involves, obviously, Catholicism still, because it is a direct sequel to the original, but also other denominations and even religions in coming to meet this spiritual force. So their critique, this person's critique, is that it is moving in the direction you were just talking about, where the spiritual realm is more of like a magic zone, and it's less specific than it is in the earlier movies, and they see this as a loss. So you're kind of tapping into something that, from this person at least, the Exorcist Believer movie is very much purporting. So I think that puts us at the end of our time. So thank you again for coming out for this morning discussion of horror and being such an engaged audience. Appreciate you.